Hello analysts. Today I'm going to be going over a SQL tutorial within the SAS programming environment. I'm using SAS Enterprise Guide today in SAS On Demand. Many of you will already be familiar with the Proc contents procedure, which returns all of the variables that are in your data set, and also the Proc freq procedure, which will return all of the values for character variables that you name after the table statement. So I'm not going to go over that too much. I'm just going to show you the results. Here's the results of the Proc contents procedure. We can see that there's a little over 17,000 observations and 24 variables. And here are all the variables. Disease is the one that specifies the types of diseases, and it's a character variable. So here's the freq procedure, which shows us all of the values under the variable disease. And you can see influenza avian down here, which basically is bird flu, which is what I'm interested in analyzing. And here you can see how many observations are in the data set. So it's not very many, so it'll be great because it'll load fast for us throughout this tutorial. So I've commented out that I'm beginning the Proc SQL tutorial here, and you tell SAS that you're going to start programming in SQL by starting with Proc SQL. And SAS has just made it really convenient for people who are comfortable in SQL to just transition into programming in SAS. You can basically code everything out in SQL, just, in the SAS programming environment. So now this is all SQL syntax. This just is special for SAS. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first, I'm going to erase this. I'm going to show you how you would do the same thing with SQL like we did up here. So if you wanted to see all of the values under the variable disease, we call them columns in SQL. We don't really refer to all the columns as variables. So what I would do is I would do a select statement to indicate which variable I'm interested in looking at. And if you don't want every single one listed, you just want the distinct values. That means each distinct value will only come up once. You'll be looking at a lot less data. You'll just be seeing, what are all the different values under disease, but not every single row that has each disease listed. So that's the variable disease. Distinct tells us we only want to see each value once. And then from indicates the name of the data set. So this is the name of the data set right here. And it's in the work library. So in SAS, you want to put the name of the library before the data set. And then you just enter the semicolon, and then we write quit with SQL instead of run. And here we can see results. So down here is the SAS, and then now we have SQL. So you don't see as much information on the frequency count and the cumulative frequency count and everything like that. But you are seeing exactly what was coded, which are just the distinct values. We're not going to see avian influenza over and over. We only see it once, and every single other value we're going to see it once. So that's how you would do it in SQL. And then if we want to take a subset, then what we would do is begin with Proc SQL again, and we would use a create table statement. And that is basically like, taking what we call a subset in SAS. If this is a data lake, we're creating like a data pond, something smaller. We're just taking a chunk of the data, so we get to name what we want to call it. I'm going to call it bird flu, and that's going to be the name of your table. In SQL, we call them tables instead of data sets. Same thing, just a little different lingo. And then the as select statement tells us what variables we want to look at. A star indicates that we want to keep all of them. So I'm going to put an asterisk for that. Asterisk, I called star, it's actually asterisk. But basically it just means, we want to keep all of the columns. And then we put a from statement, indicate the library, and then the name of the data set again. And then I'm going to put a where statement because I only want to see influenza avian or bird flu. And what I like to do is just copy and paste things sometimes, because sometimes we don't know exactly what it's stored as. You can't, it's not case sensitive when you program like all of the syntax, but then when you put an actual value for a character variable, it has to be exact. And it is case sensitive. So anything like within the quotes that's in purple is going to be case sensitive, and it's a value under the character variable. This is the variable or the column name. And that's not case sensitive, but the value is. So that's why I did that. And so then you can see that we're going to get what we call an output data set in SAS. And in SQL, we refer to it as a table. But basically, this is how you take a chunk of that lake. And this is what we would call, a pond, just a smaller number. You can see that there's going to be just a little over 6,000 in the data set. Now, in the real world, we're not going to be able to drag through all this data. We can't really figure that number out very easy because we're going to be dealing with much larger data sets. But that just gives you an idea of what's created. So there's nothing in the results over here in SAS. The output data set is generated right there. And that's how we check. But say we couldn't scroll all the way down and we can't actually look at all of our data. How do we figure out the number of rows? We would go Proc SQL, and then we want to select count asterisk. So the count just counts up the number of rows, and here we put an asterisk for all of them. And we do an as statement when we want to call it a name. I'm going to call it total rows because that's what we're actually counting. And then I named my new table or subset, whatever you want to call it, bird flu. Here we see it popping up in the pop-up. So I can just click the space bar to have that pop in. And then we just end with quit again. And this is going to count up the total rows for us. So now we'll see a value returned, which is just the number of rows in the table. And I verified that for you when we, actually scrolled down. So in the real world, you won't be able to scroll down. You see how it's taking a long time to load. The real world, it would take forever. So this is how you would figure that out. So I'm going to just take that SAS out. Now we know how to do it in SQL. So I'm not even going to worry about it anymore. We're just going to keep the SQL on the screen. So let me show you what would happen if we hadn't put as total rows and gave it a name. We get the same number because we programmed it to count up the rows for us, but see how it is just called nothing. So that's why you want to, name it something, because you want to keep track of what you did. Sometimes you're programming really fast and you go through all kinds of stuff, and then, what did I do? You want to keep track of it. So now I'm going to check some of the variables, like how would you, instead of running proc contents, how would you see all of the variables in your data set? So you're going to do proc SQL, and I'm going to say select all of the data, and then basically, you name the data set again, but in the real world, you might not be able to view all of it. It would take forever, right? So we use what's called a limit statement normally in the SQL programming language. You would say limit 5, and then you would just return the top 5 observations for what we call, rows in SQL, but you can see how limit is not coming up in blue. In SAS, this is a difference between like MySQL, Oracle SQL, PostgreSQL. Almost all the SQL languages use a limit statement. In SAS, we use the same obs equals statement that we normally use. So that limit statement, it does not work. So if you guys want to code SQL somewhere else, you probably will use it. So I'm going to comment that out, that normally we use like limit 5 in SQL, but here we're going to do obs equals 5, and that will tell us what variables we've got, which is just like the contents procedure in SAS. So here we are, and you can see we only have 5 rows because we did obs equals 5, but because of our asterisks, we see all of the variable names. We can see we got a lot of null values back there. And so here are the diseases. Oh, whoops. Probably should have done that on the new table, bird flu. The variables are the same though, but because I've created that table, we'll use that from now on. So say I wanted to investigate some variables. The date would probably be an important one, right? So here I've got only avian influenza now, and I've got an observation date and a reporting date. So which one of those am I going to use during my analysis or reporting, whatever I'm doing? Which date is good? So I can show you how, I would go about figuring that out. So I would do proc SQL, and then I would do another select statement to tell it what variables I want to look at. And here I'm going to count the reporting date, and I'm going to name it reporting date. And then I'm going to count the observation date. And I'm going to name it also observation date, right? And then I'm going to actually shorten that. It would be better just because just long. Okay, observed date. And then I'm going to name the table from bird flu. Oh, whoops. From bird flu. And then we end with the quit statement again. And so we'll take a look at that. And so here in the results we see the dates reported are the same as the total rows. The dates that they observed the bird flu are not always recorded, so it's probably not as good of a date value to use for analytic purposes. It's really convenient that the reporting date is always recorded. That's pretty rare. Notice that I put a comma in between the variable names. Here I'm counting the number of rows for reporting date, and I put as, renamed it, then you would put the comma. If it was just a variable and then another variable, you just separate it with one comma as well. But basically everything that goes with one variable is separated by a comma, and you have to use commas. That's one thing you might forget as a SAS programmer because we don't really use commas. Anyway, so that's pretty much what I'm going to end with for my first video because I'm almost at 15 minutes, and I will create the next one here in just a second.